Why? Hold on. Hello.
Hey everyone.
How are you doing?
Pretty good. How are you? That was meant for you guys.
I've been better.
We're hanging in there, everyone. We are hanging in there.
By
It is,
thread.
yeah, March 13, 2025. In the DMV area is the moods. We're feeling it.
Yeah, low energy, low energy.
But we're here and we're really excited to bring another episode to our spot. Again, we really thank you all for listening and for just riding along this journey with Cassie and I to kind of explore these topics, build community, and ultimately just create this safe space for all of us to explore these ideas that we have. We hope you have been enjoying the last couple episodes and we're coming on. We're here, episode 5.
Yes, come in, take a seat, and there will be only alcoholic beverages served here. So please, I'm just kidding about that, but please just come in and relax and enjoy this conversation. Okay, so so for today's topic, this is our first topic about gender, okay? This is the title of the episode is called The Taciturn Woman. So in today's episode, we are going to talk about what this means, right? The taciturn woman. So from our perspective, it's about women and, my working theory, I guess, is that women are raised to be more accommodating and passive, which leads them to have an inability to say no or be confrontational. We are going to talk about how women are raised to be agreeable. We're going to talk about how this affects women in the professional workplace or in dating. And then we're going to talk about how we can possibly start saying no a little bit more, maybe being a little bit more confrontational at times if necessary, a little bit more contentious.
Yeah, and a little backstory on how this topic even came about for Cassie and I. I think me and her have always a lot of conversations relating to gender. And one of the things, especially when it comes to speaking about like dating, one of the common themes that we're always bringing up or that we notice comes up a lot in conversations is this whole like women, we don't know how to say no and we struggle with boundaries. And obviously, our history with like codependence, that's like codependency 101, right? Where you kind of feel like you need to accommodate everything so everybody else is okay. But it's also like, where does it stem from? So we just felt like, this would be a good topic to kind of bring it up and talk about the genders. And it's also really interesting because originally Cassie had brought up this topic as the taciturn female. It was kind of referring to the topic and referring to women as females. And, I was like, why? Well, first of all, I kind of told her, I was like, that kind of makes me feel a little bit uncomfortable. So we had a little bit of a conversation about the wording around using like women versus female. And, to Cassie's defense, she was very like naive in her usage of the word female. Like it wasn't with any intent. It was just like, okay, that's a word. But I had brought up the point that sometimes when referring to women in using the word female can kind of have like a derogatory connotation. Obviously, biologically, that's the term. But when it comes to referring to women like in a societal standard and norms, it's kind of a little bit more acceptable to use women versus just female because it can basically categorize women into like this animalistic um view that, well, they are just a female. Usually you use that for like animals. So it's like referring to ourselves more as women versus like that animalistic, hierarchical biological term. And it was very interesting because Cassie was just like, I never thought it that way. But we did want to kind of just bring that up because I know for some people, if you see the word female thrown around, that's kind of where it's coming from. But I think in general, referring to women as women and not females is a little bit more acceptable, and just respectful.
So, yeah, so I just want to kind of throw in my piece about that, which is I refer to myself a lot of the time as female. And usually when I'm talking about other women, like, so, so before Driz said something to me about this, a friend told me, he questioned me. He said, I've noticed that you refer to yourself as female and you say that, you throw that word around a lot. And it seems like, I'm just questioning like the influence, like where does that come from, right? So it literally, this stemmed a huge, not, I don't want to say argument, but it was this conversation that we had, hours long conversation. And then eventually, Driz said the same thing when she was, doing research for this and she saw my notes and she's like, I don't really understand that either. So biologically speaking, right, when we are even like in the studies that we're referencing, like people check off a box, male or female, right? That is biologically speaking for a species, but that can be for so many other species, right? And what Driz just said is right. So I'm not talking about a cat that can be female. We're referring to women. And so, whenever it comes to the taciturn woman, we are talking about socially, like how we have socially evolved, how we are raised to be, I don't know if passive is the right word, but like more accommodating towards others, right? And for me, again, the word female comes from a Latin term that literally means woman. You can go back in time and maybe it meant something different, but for about the last 10 years or so, the people that are using the word female are using it in a derogatory sense. And it's 2025 and language matters. So we're not going to be, and by we, I mean me, I am not going to be tossing around that word very lightly. As much as I want to say it doesn't matter, it does. So, taciturn woman.
Yeah, and what I love is that, it is just a very old-fashioned way of referring to women, but we can even explore a little bit more on the context of where that even came about, right? The objectification of women and women were seen as property and all of that. We could go into that or not.
Hmm.
But even we bring this up in the beginning of this episode because just like Cassie was using that term with no harm, um, I think it is important to pay attention to the words that we use because language does matter. And going forward, actual um, meaning that may be biased or may be outdated, and maybe it is time to kind of like reflect on it. But yeah, we kind of just wanted to throw that out there. Um, and again, would love to hear your experiences if you've ever been called that in a non-friendly way, or if maybe you're like asking, you're like, oh no, I use that word all the time, didn't think about it, because that's cool too, right? I think that's part of having these conversations and realizing like, whoa, I did not realize that, and then doing a little research and kind of seeing, well, this is the context of it, right? But back to our general topic of women just being more um accommodating, where, well, let's just talk a little bit about it, Cassie. Why do you think this is? I mean, we've touched just a little bit on that, but is it inherently a biological trait that women are people pleasers, or, are there influences that have kind of conditioned this to have to be?
I think it's a combination of both, right? It's like the two things can exist at the same time. But I think, in generally speaking, in again, very general sense, I want to like also kind of throw that out there when we're just speaking about women in general in Western cultures. With the research that I had, what the research points to is that we're socially, this is a social norm, right? So we're raised to be more accommodating as a woman. You know, we're given kitchen sets to play with when we're little, to cook, right? And we're taught to care about other people's feelings, right? Like, don't hurt someone else's feelings. So, as a little girl, this is what we're taught. And, those are just two examples, and maybe they're not the best examples. We can get into it a little bit more, but um, I think that generally speaking, we are raised as women. I was raised to not, cause rifts, don't be, loud. Um, not say yes. Like, my parents never were like, you always have to say yes, and like never, don't stand up for what's right. Like, I was never raised like that. But I think generally speaking, when we're talking about not just being raised like in the household, but like the media that's around us, right? Like our social influences, everything that is around us kind of points to um, being raised where these social norms are, it's people pleasing. We need to be more accommodating, and it's harder for us to say no in that way. And it's harder for us to not even just say no, but maybe set boundaries to something that we are not comfortable with.
Yeah, those are all pretty like spot on points. I too was raised very similar. Obviously, I come from a very uh traditional Latin country where women have roles and have a place in society. And I agree with it also being a mix of like maybe biological and environmental,
Mhm.
because like, and again, we can argue this, right? Where it's like, well, women, because we create life, and well, you can create life, um, we're naturally more nurturing.
Mhm.
Um, but I mean, I could argue that is that the case, or is that part of just being um, conditioned, right, from a very young age by getting um, chick chicken sets. I know I was gonna say that.
Mhm.
Kitchen sets and getting baby dolls. Like, I do wonder if boys were also given those tools at a much younger age, would they demonstrate similar traits of nurturing and, I don't want to say people pleasing or codependence, but like those aspects that are usually those attributes that are usually given to women when it comes to like being more nurturing. I don't know. But I would say always there's a combination. Nothing is black and white. Things are gray. But I think it's just really interesting how our generation is finally realizing like, nope, I can say no. I no longer depend on a man to open a bank account, or I can drive, right? So like our safety does not 100% depend on men, and we have a voice, and we've demonstrated that not just in the home but also in society, by being educated, by having um, positions of power. When I say power, I mean like we hold leadership roles in the communities. We have positions in companies that are very high up, C-suite level position. So, we have a seat at the table, and that's taken years to get here. Um, and it's still challenged, right? Like, I'm pretty sure that there are many women in C-suite level positions or in higher level up positions who may not be accepted. I don't know how common, or in comparison to before, how common it is now. But yeah, I think it is definitely a condition and a little bit of a nurture versus nature type thing.
Yeah. So, like, Driz and I have had conversations about this, revolving around our own personal experiences on a day-to-day basis with, should I speak up? Like, can I speak up for this? Can I say this? Can I do this? Should I do this? Right. And I have a friend specifically who struggles with it. And like, her and I, for years, have been trying to work on being more assertive, right? Being more assertive, just in relationships, right? This isn't necessarily just with men, but like, we're talking about. I mean, the 2 points that we're hitting on today are professionally, and then also in the dating world and the dating market. But this is in relationships, like with your grandmother, with your parents, with your sister, with your brother, with your friends, right? Like, how do I set boundaries? How am I able to bring something up that made me uncomfortable? How am I able to really just stand up for myself? Like, this is what we're saying when we're talking about taciturn female. How can we have a voice, right? Without feeling like a bitch, without feeling like we're going too far. And it's funny because one of the articles that I found was a Harvard Gazette article from 2016, where it's specifically about men and women in the workplace, but I thought it was very interesting because the author points out that women handle conflict differently. So, as where men would usually shake hands after, a conflict, like they handle it much better. Women actually associate it with um, I don't want to say detriment, but like it's more severe for them. So they can go years without talking to someone that they had a conflict with, right? So it's almost like they're a little bit uh, more fearful of the repercussions of that conflict, of standing up for themselves, of saying something that might be disliked, and especially with another woman as well. So I think that that is something that I would need to reflect on a little bit more um, in my own personal experience. But it's interesting to think about, right? How do you think you're able, for me, am I able to bring this up to a person in my personal life, something that I don't like that they're doing or something that makes me uncomfortable, and our relationship doesn't fall apart, right? Or is it going to fall apart? Or is it going to make this person think negatively of me, right? So really, it's just like, what are the repercussions that I think are going to come from this?
Yeah, I was just gonna say, and I think, as you're sharing that, Cassie, I'm trying to like think what the causes could be for in that study, right? It's saying that basically when a conflict arises, so for example, two women have a difference in opinions, they have an argument,
Yeah,
and that leads to a fallout or some type of longer, what will you call it? Not conflict, but like a disagreement for a longer period of time than, for example, with our counterparts, men.
yeah,
And and to me, it's like, I also think that goes back to like having a different opinion is not has not for a woman to have their own opinion and it be different is has not always been encouraged.
hmm,
We're taught to kind of go with the flow, or be appeasing and don't ruffle feathers, versus I think men are taught to they're encouraged actually
hmm,
to be able to have that difference in opinion. So I think for them it seemed more normal, as for us it's like, oh no, something's wrong with us. And even as you're sharing, you're like, you have to sit back and reflect, like, well, why do I think differently than this person?
hmm,
Because I'm a whole different human being. I'm
hmm,
allowed to have a difference in opinion.
hmm,
That is what makes us human. And I just think a lot of time we as women don't give ourselves the space to do that. And
hmm,
again, I just think that's just because it's not encouraged. We're encouraged to kind of go with the flow, be appeasable, not think out of the box, right?
hmm,
For centuries we weren't. It was not safe to do so either.
hmm,
Versus I do think men are encouraged um to do that. So if they have a difference in opinion with their friend, to them it's like, "Oh, that's normal. Cool. Shake our hands, keep it moving." Versus the girls are going to be looking at each other like, "Oh, something's wrong with you.
hmm,
What's wrong with me? Why can we not agree on this?
hmm,
We don't need to agree on it. We're two different people.
hmm.
We're two different human beings. We're two different brains." So again, I could attribute that, and that's my personal opinion, but I can attribute that to just like we've been taught for years. And it's, yeah, it's kind of just what came to my mind.
I think so. I think that that's like a perfect summary. I think I also agree, and I also think that you know that probably plays a huge part in how we bring up, right? Like how I would possibly bring up a difference of opinion or how I would bring up something, right? So if I'm raised to be agreeable, if I'm raised to go with the flow, when I do have something that could be, considered to cause conflict in a relationship, then I'm anxiety stricken. I'm in my head. How do I go about this? To talk about it with other people, and then when I bring it up, am I bringing it up in the right way, right? As to where maybe a man has done this a dozen times, and I've done it once or twice. And so maybe I'm not as used to it. I don't have as much experience with it. So maybe I'm not bringing it up in quote unquote the right way, right? Or in a more experienced way because I don't have as much experience with it. And that's like, again, this is just like a thought of mine, like a kind of like a byproduct of what we're kind of talking about. Um, but I think that that also can be, that's a different angle of looking at it as well, or another level of it at least.
Yeah, when you say like bringing it up the right way, right? Like
Yeah.
that brings to my mind. So I have a lot of nieces and nephews,
Mm,
and I was heavily involved in their lives growing up, like during my teen years and all of that. And in my household, I grew up being very like, you don't speak up, because if you speak up, either you're going to get hit, right? Or you're going to get shamed, or you just do what your parents told you to do. Like you don't give your opinion. And one of my nieces was very, very, very vocal growing up. From a little kid, I mean, 5, 6 years old, she just said whatever came to her mind. She was very outspoken. She was that kid in school who, like, the teachers on the report card would literally give the feedback like, great student, but she talks too much.
mm,
And I remember in her maybe my like early 20s, her like preteen teenage years, that time of that age, which is like already really hard to navigate. There was some like rough stuff going on in our house, and there was a lot of arguments, and she wouldn't shut up. Like she just would say whatever was on her mind. She would get involved in the arguments of like the adults, and me being 20, 21, like I remember always, like I would just tell her, I'm like, look, if you just keep quiet, everything's gonna be fine. Like I
mm,
kind of, in some ways, like I felt like I was trying to teach her to survive in the way that I learned to survive in that household.
yeah.
And just basically like, listen, just go with the flow, because the more you give your opinion and the more you like speak up, it's just going to make things worse.
Mm,
And I remember we spoke about this a couple of months ago, and she actually told me that like she kind of got upset that I said that to her,
mhm,
because she couldn't understand why I was telling her to shut up when she was feeling this way, right? When she was having these thoughts and these feelings and these opinions that she felt she had a right to express, and which rightfully so. I'm very proud that her mom taught her to be that way, to be vocal. But again, I think about like the way that I was raised and how she was already chastised and kind of punished for being vocal and expressing herself at a young age, because in my family, like, that was not seen as okay.
mm.
Granted, now she's like a very um young woman who is amazing and has great opinions and all that, but I always think about that experience, how I was raised. I guess I was trying to teach her to kind of keep it also passive, to keep the not rock the boat too much because things were escalating in the house, versus she was just like, well, I'm gonna say whatever I want. And I like 100% can like applaud that now looking back into it. I'm like, no, if I ever have a daughter, I would love her to speak her mind. I mean, obviously there's a time and place for everything, and being tactful and learning emotional intelligence, when to say things, not to be accommodating, but because we are 8 billion people in the world. So, learning skills to communicate is also really important, but that does not necessarily mean that you need to stay silent, right? So, I do always think about that experience and how that shaped me to understand like, the way I did things was just out of fear, and again, how I learned to survive, but that's not necessarily mean that that's how it should always be.
That's I feel like a powerful story. And it also reminds me of a story with my family too, but I'm not going to get into that. What I am going to say is that the friend I was referring to earlier, her and I talk sometimes. I mean, we talk, this is seriously something that she, like a skill she has been mastering for years, is just speaking up for herself. And I am always in awe of women that, like, think about like a Erin Brockovich, right? Like if you've seen that movie where you're, at least for me, I'm like, that's like a badass woman, right? Like that's a woman that's like can stand up for what is right and what she believes, right? And they depict her in the movie as, cussing a lot and stuff like that. But I'm not, again, like what Driz said, being tactful, being respectful, those things I value, and I hope others value them as well. But yeah, I mean, I want some of what your niece has.
Honestly, I still ask her. I gotta reach out to her and be like, so tell me how you learned that at such a young age, because it's actually really empowering, and I love that. I love that she has that like fire in her.
One of the articles that I found is why, right? So, like, why women have a hard time saying no. Driz and I have already kind of touched on our experiences and kind of how we have been raised a little bit. Um, so this is a Psychology Today article by Catherine Lively. This was written in 2013. So she says, as young children, girls are socialized to be nice and to be more in touch with their own and other people's feelings than are boys. There's nothing wrong with being nice, and there's definitely nothing wrong with being liked. But boys, on the other hand, are socialized to be less attuned to other people's feelings and to win. Um, and again, I feel like for me, something that kind of pops up is an experience I had where I had a friend, a guy, right? A man who I almost said a male, uh, who was essentially, he said, I don't know why you ask me, like why you text me before you call. He said, you always do that. You always text me like, hey, like can you talk? And he's like, I don't get it. Like, I don't understand. And I had to like think about it because it offended me when he told me this, right? I was offended. I was like, why am I some kind of, I literally thought about it in my head. I was like, am I some kind of freak for doing that? I had time to think about it and I was like, I brought it up to him. I ask, before if he has the availability to talk, because I am always considering him and his feelings, what he could possibly have going on. Like, not his feelings, but like, I'm trying to be considerate. And I feel like that's like a perfect example as well, where it's like, I don't know, if I'm sure there are exceptions to this. I'm sure some men are very, very considerate at times. I'm sure some men are raised to be considerate, but I think generally speaking, again, women are considering other people's time, right? We're trying to be respectful. We're trying to consider, what's going on with that other person, what they could right? So what could they possibly be going through at this point in time, or like how are they feeling, or what are they thinking? And again, maybe some men have that experience.
Well, I think it's interesting that you bring up that example that has like such a minimal, thoughtless like action that we do it without even thinking about it.
Hmm.
And then it's not until somebody else points it out and they're like, why do you do that? And then you're like, well, I don't know. And there's like so many other examples about that in the workplace. Like, for example, with me, I noticed that I would constantly in my emails at work say sorry and say please. And I stopped that. About a year ago, literally have been, I actually use ChatGPT sometimes to edit my emails
Hmm.
to make it seem just more direct and concise because I would catch myself saying, like, oh, sorry, I missed your email. No, thank you for your patience. I am now getting to your email. Like, changing our language from a place of like that appeasing, like worrying about, oh, I'm sorry, I got late to your email. Like, no, I was busy, I was working. Thank you for your patience. Like, just changing your language in small things like that. Same thing. I don't say, please respond to this email by Monday at COB. The deadline for this email is Monday at COB. Respond at your, by the deadline or something like that. Removing those words are those kind of like filler words that just kind of give like people pleasing vibes, like those little changes you don't notice it. And I didn't notice it until somebody brought it up, and then I started implementing it at my work. Right? But just those little things that sometimes you don't catch it until somebody like points it out, and you're like, oh, I didn't even realize I do that. Why do I do that? And it's all kind of just tied to how we're just kind of taught to be.
You know, I think that's awesome. I think it's awesome that you've incorporated that. And like again, this is something that I don't think a lot of men and maybe some women have to think about. Like they don't have to think like, "Oh, I'm going to start changing my language and oh, I'm going to start like tweaking this." But awesome of you to do that. And I'm going to again take try and take a note out of your book. A couple of the articles that I researched that you all will have access to have to do with the workplace, right? And so whenever it comes to the workplace and saying no, we can look at this in a couple different ways. So for me personally, my experience has to do with like negotiating pay. So like asking for more money for my position seems like seems like I'm a burden or that, I get fearful of asking for more money whenever I know deep down inside I'm worth more. I'm highly educated, I'm more than competent, I'm capable, I'm loyal, I'm hardworking. So there's that aspect. And then there's another aspect of just saying no in the workplace, right? So like being scared to say no to some like your boss or supervisor or whatever asking you to do something. So I found a really interesting article by Catherine O'Brien that said it's titled "Just Saying No: An Examination of Gender Differences in the Ability to Decline Requests in the Workplace." Um, this article was written in 2014 and it's really so it's actually a dissertation that she wrote for her PhD, and you all will have access to it. But just so you know, it's long. It's like 100 pages long. So I wouldn't expect you to read it. It's double space. It's very easy read, but you can like, read at the beginning and the end and you'll have the gist of it. But essentially, she does three separate studies in this for her dissertation. And the first study assesses how well men and women feel, um, so how they feel when they respond to professional requests. And it essentially examines whether differences exist in men's and women's willingness to say no at work. And so she had a sample of 911 people between the ages of 18 and 66. There's like a breakdown. It was overwhelmingly white people, which actually this all of the studies that I ended up pulling up for this, unfortunately, that was a case. Um, so she examines all kinds of theories whenever it comes to this, and then she does an analysis, and actually she does a regression analysis. It's awesome, is what it is. So some of the studies that she has that she references, she says that, women may not say no because they feel they ought to respond in helpful ways and fear the ramifications of, she says, eschewing communal behaviors. The second study examines in more detail, like theoretical explanations for the way people may differentially respond to professional requests. So maybe women will be viewed differently when saying no professionally compared to a man. Um, and then the third and final study assesses two interventions designed to increase one's ability to strategically say no. So we'll touch on that at the end of this episode. What she found is that people who say yes, which like everyone knows, people who say yes in the workplace, they're evaluated higher on performance, which can lead to promotions and other rewards. And she examines other theories that could explain why women find it difficult to say no, right? So she talks about gender stereotypes and women's ability to say no. So, for instance, a typical man may be more inclined to say no due to being in a higher position status at work. He's used to saying no all the time. That's part of
Hmm.
his job. Where the typical woman perhaps would be more likely be engaged in a more communal profession where opportunities are fewer to say no.
Yeah, I think the article is that study. Is it a study?
It's a study. Yeah,
It is a study.
she did a lot.
It's really interesting because like it is true. I mean, when you had that typical worker, which a lot of time, it is women, unfortunately, who says yes to everything. Yes, I can do this, and raises her hand, and I can, I'll be helpful and I'll do this. And usually what happens? It leads to burnout. It leads to you being exhausted. It leads to you not being happy at the job because you feel like you're doing everybody's work. Um, so I think that article kind of touches right on being able to say no and holding your boundaries so that you can show up and sh- basically actually use the skills that you've worked hard to get into that position for. um that being able to say no open gives you that space and that time to be able to have time for the other tasks at work. So I think it is important that we don't just say yes to a bunch of tasks for the sake of earning, for the sake of a hope of a future promotion, right? And obviously once you're higher up in the ladder and you have leverage in the company and you've been there for a long time, you can say no maybe a lot more easier. But I would say that a lot of women are very educated, and when you're hired into a position, you don't need to question whether you need to like prove your worth. Like if you were hired, you're meant to be there. And I do think that that also ties into like women just consistently maybe questioning like, oh no, I need to prove by doing and doing and doing that I'm worth it. And it's like, no, if you got the job, it's because you deserve to be there and you can say no. And that's not going to jeopardize your job. I mean, that's not going to get you fired. Like, actually, that's going to give you room to be able to work on other projects that maybe you're interested in, or devote your time to the research in the company, or actually do the job that you were hired. So I do think that that study does do justice, I think, to the topic that we're talking about.
Yeah, I think so too. Okay, so that concludes the first part of the episode about the taciturn woman. Please stay tuned for the second part where we touch more on dating and we talk about why it's hard to say no while dating, and then also, you know, how we can start saying no a little bit more and setting more boundaries and being a little bit more bold in our responses to others. Thanks. See you soon.